getting strong doesn't only happen in the gym. It's time to present to you the Intimacy Olympics. It's time for a transformative journey where respect, communication, and connection take center stage. Consent goes beyond no means no. Learn what good consent and healthy intimacy look like in this eye-opening panel about how to relate better with your partner or partners. We will let you in on secrets to creating healthy, lasting connections that could enrich your life. Let's get intimate.
Consent panel here. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I'm from Regina, Saskatchewan. I'm an anti-racism educator. I'm really excited to be here. It's my first time in Toronto. Woo! It's like the Brady Bunch up there. Okay, so I'm gonna ask everybody to go around and introduce themselves. So we'll start with Mark.
My name is Mark Blue. It's Irish. That's a joke. It's my porn name. And I'm from Toronto. Great to be here.
Hi, my name is Emily Booker. I'm joining you all today from the shared territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, or here in Vancouver, BC. I'm a settler of mixed European heritage, and I have been working in youth-led research for the past few years, looking at addressing issues of sexual and gender-based violence through arts-based methods. And I am currently working on a research project that works across 7 different countries, looking at the sexual and reproductive health and rights of Indigenous women and girls who are living with HIV. Thanks for having me.
Emily.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here. I'm really happy to be back at this conference. And my name is Topaza, like the gem. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm currently in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is the Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. I am a counseling psychology doctoral trainee at the University of North Dakota, and I'm just really excited to be here with everyone today.
Hello, my name is Darren Silva. I'm calling in from Calgary, Treaty 7 territory and Métis Nation Region 3. I'm a community sexual health and relationships educator here. So work with a lot of youth, young adults. I also have some experience working with developing and creating healthy masculinities with young boys as well. So all things healthy relationships, sexual health, love chatting about, love being community spaces and educating. So I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you so much. So I was thinking yesterday about what consent means and thinking about me growing up and how that word was never taught to me. It was always about the scientific act of sex. And, you know, my parents would never tell me what happens in the bedroom. It's just something that happens after marriage or whatever. And there was no actual healthy conversation about what it means to have consent and stuff like that. So my first question is to Darren and Mark. What does it mean to have good consent?
Yeah, I think consent is definitely a conversation. For me, I think in doing adult entertainment, I think a lot of the consent ideally should fall on the companies producing whatever work is being filmed. I think to manage expectations. Going into a scene, what are you getting involved in? What are you not getting involved in? Is definitely a conversation that needs to be had in my mind well before a scene takes place. I think there's a certain amount of natural pressure that comes from being on site in the room, and having those conversations ahead of time is really important. As well as just like with your scene partner or partners. Obviously, most of what I'm going to be talking about is porn. So whether that speaks to you or not, go off. But yeah, having those conversations with your scene partners, being able to, consent can also come from within you, which is where I think sometimes that can be a challenge for some people. Someone can pay lip service to, if you need a break, just take it. But that's something that needs to come from you. Hopefully at the higher level, that's always respected, but we can kind of, I'm sure, get into some of that later. Thanks.
And Darren?
Yeah, I think when I think about consent, like oftentimes, oh, I hear a bit of an echo. I hope it's not me. We think about kind of what feels good physically, or just thinking about the body. But I think when I like to think about consent, I think about what it means to have fully embodied consent. So not just what feels good physically, or what is nice physically, or how people's bodies feel, but then start to think about what are the thoughts? Like, what kind of questions do they have? Are we making space for their questions? Are we giving them time to maybe ask questions or feel like it's a non-judgmental space? And just maybe for their emotions as well. Like if people's emotions are involved, how recognizing what sorts of situations could put pressure on people's emotions or change them in certain ways. So I think full embodied consent is something that I really like to consider, not just what feels good physically, but allowing space for thoughts and then feelings as well to kind of come into the picture.
My next question is kind of comes with a trigger warning. So if anyone feels uncomfortable with a question, I'll say something, and if you can go get a coffee or something. So this is for Mark. What are some examples of where consent can be blurry and would probably need clarifying?
So I would kind of maybe separate this into kind of two of my lines of work. One would be in the like as a self-content creator, aka through companies like OnlyFans, Just for Fans, etc., and then studio work. So on the content creation side, I think some of the lines can get blurry because it feels less formal. So someone is coming over, you've had like a quick conversation over a social media app. What are we going to get into? Which is mainly, in my experience, more like, okay, who's fucking who here? Or whom. But those kind of the the way that I just want to laugh at anything sexual, and like that's what I do. Like I'm like the nuts and bolts, and I'm like, haha, nut. But sometimes those the specifics, because you're doing it less formally, you maybe don't. You're quicker to kind of just jump into things. I personally am very grateful that I got into this line of work a little bit later in life. I know, shocking. I look 19. So I feel more comfortable. Like I've, in a more informal filming situation, just been like, okay, we can ease up on the spacing there. Some people miss or get a little excited. So sometimes there are moments like that. I personally, having had a couple of experiences with arranging filming, just kind of going through it ahead of time. What are we doing? Establishing that it's, we can stop whenever we want, easy to take a break, whatever that is, kind of like check in. I think studio work, again, I think it can get blurry with internally like a sense of pressure. Like it's like, okay, you're here, lights are set, people are waiting, like, it's like, okay, it's go time. And sometimes the expectations may not be communicated like really, really clearly ahead of time. I've done studio work where they've said like, just so you know, like we want to get this done quickly, so there's no stopping. And while I would love to think that I'm, in my mind I can be like, okay, eye roll, like we can stop when I literally stop fucking. but there's still that little like pressure thing that goes off. I think, I've heard of situations where last minute a scene partner gets changed. So it's kind of like, oh, now you're with this person. And, ideally, all of the scene partners are kind of agreed upon by all parties ahead of time. Sometimes that doesn't happen. I can understand from a company perspective that, like, things get changed last minute. Someone's sick, someone's whatever. But sometimes those like little details aren't arranged until the day of, and that's where, personally, I would think like the thing is that porn can be a little bit like the Wild Wild West. There isn't necessarily an industry standard for some of these things. There are companies with better reputations than others that will do like very clear consent checklists ahead of time. Are you okay with this? Are you not okay with this? And then sometimes you film an entire scene and they're like, oh, can we film that checklist after now so we can have it on record? But you just finished doing it. So there's some blur for sure.
I guess this question is for, Darren. So in terms of like even in relationships, are there sort of like times and moments where maybe their partner isn't being clear on what they want and use like body language, just kind of like consent can be blurry inside the bedroom with your intimate partner, and what would they do and how would like maybe they would respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's really entirely possible that like consent becomes a blurry thing within a relationship after many interactions, after the relationship's been kind of ongoing for a bit. I think it's really important to, like, as Mark's mentioned, that can be pressures to kind of live up to expectations and assumptions even within a relationship, to just know that those can always impact the way that someone consents. So when we talk about consent, we like to talk about kind of not just looking at what's been talking about specifically verbally, whatever, but then looking at someone's body language to know that maybe they are feeling pressured, or to know that they maybe are feeling like they have to live up to an expectation. So we always just try and encourage people to be like mindful of specific language so that they're not putting an expectation or assumption, creating that power dynamic that maybe feels like someone cannot explicitly communicate consent within a relationship, the bedroom, etc. And knowing that those like ongoing check-ins can kind of, kind of check those assumptions and expectations that sometimes people think that there has to be in relationships. I know sometimes that can also exist within specific gender norms and gender roles, that certain folks are meant to be more submissive, some are meant to be more dominant, and that can really, really impact the way someone feels they can communicate about consent if they feel they have to live up to those. So we always just talk about using language to, really check and challenge those expectations and assumptions that people might have, even within ongoing existing relationships.
Especially with boundaries too. And I find that boundaries is kind of like, it's kind of like a new buzzword, but I know people have had that or said the words before, but typically teaching high school, that's always like they're setting boundaries for their partner, not necessarily themselves. So this question is for Emily. What does a good boundary look like to you?
That's a great question. And I think it's kind of a hard question because I really liked, Darren, what you were talking about with the way in which consent is embodied. I also kind of think about consent as being something that's fluid. And it's, I think, also similar to boundaries as well. Is it something that you feel out for yourself, and it's something that you get to decide whether or not you like it, but it can also change. And so with that in mind, I think a good boundary is one that you are able to articulate in the right moment, and one that you're able to reflect on and think about, why is this boundary here? And if I want to assert a boundary, how am I going to go about doing it in a way that is safe for me and also safe for my partner or partners?
And what are some of the ways that people can react to a violated boundary for Topeza?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways someone who experienced a violated boundary could react, and however a person reacts is valid because that's their lived experience. And I think it's important to honor the different emotions and feelings that arises and allowing space for those things to just be experienced and like flowed through our bodies. And an example of how I might personally react to a violated boundary can look very different from how you may react. And it's really vital that we meet people where they're at and meet folks where they are at in terms of emotional capacity and where they are in their lives. So when I think about when I have a boundary that's violated, I often first just acknowledge the situation or event and the emotions and the feelings associated with it, whether that is madness, sadness, disbelief, or whatever emotions you have associated with it. And from there, you can kind of let the violator know how you feel and what they did was hurtful and made you feel like you were disrespected. And after that, you can also restate your boundary again, just to remind them of what your boundary was. Or the other case too, you can always choose to not address the violator because it's very emotionally towing. So understanding your own emotional capacity and doing what's best for you.
Why the conversations are important beforehand and for consent and stuff, because sometimes you don't know if you're violating somebody's boundaries, right? So like for Topeza, what if I accidentally violate my partner's boundaries?
I think it's really important to first acknowledge that you did violate your partner's boundary. And one of the things that you can do is by really asking your partner in terms of like, hey, like, I recognize that I might have violated your boundary. Can you tell me more about that? So getting a better understanding of how you violated the boundary, what were the emotions that kind of was elicited from it? Because I always tell my clients who comes into my clinic that none of us are mind readers. So you can't expect your partner to read your mind, and they can't expect you to read their mind. So first understanding the situation and kind of getting a better idea of like how you can handle it in a collaborative space. And that can look like very different, a variety of ways. And that's a conversation that you and your partner should have. But I would just recommend going in with an open mind, compassion, and empathy.
And I think like having those conversations are important for sure, but I know that like a lot of high schoolers or just adults they get so weird talking about sex, and I do too. Like I laugh a lot or whatever, but it's like having those conversations beforehand can be quote unquote like cringy, right? So how can we have that conversation about consent without making it awkward? This one's for Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things. I think personally, I think it's okay to acknowledge the weirdness of some of the conversations. Acknowledge if it feels cringy, if it is kind of funny. If you're like, sorry, you're gonna come where? Like, it's it doesn't have to be for me. Like it's like, oh, okay, I need to have my serious face on because. For me personally, like also establishing trust with someone is can be like sharing a laugh, sharing whatever while still accomplishing the end goal. This is for me personally. I also just love doing things over text. Like sometimes those weird conversations, or not weird, but like what might feel weird to me. If I've done it ahead of time, I've like gathered my thoughts, I know which specific things I want to ask, that then it's done because in the moment, I might forget, they might forget, and then you're hopefully avoiding some of those situations. Again, I think in the world of porn, sometimes as a performer, maybe that agency doesn't, you might not feel that because, plenty of times if I'm going to film with someone ahead of time, they've told me who they are. It's not like we're having, like, here's their phone number, you can have this conversation ahead of time. It's kind of on us to reach out to each other, kind of go over some of that stuff. Which is where, at least for me personally, like having, knowing kind of which studios I'm interested in working with, which can honestly just be like reputation based, which is tricky because, you can be wrong. But having your idea of what you're interested in ahead of time, communicating that as best as possible, knowing that you're able to, as people have mentioned, change that at any time, which is challenging in some of those situations. Porn, to me, is not necessarily an authentic representation of a sexual experience between two or more people, or just with yourself. There are cuts, there are changes, and again, there's kind of the additional pressure of like multiple people who are standing around, expecting something to be finished so they can go home and go about their day. But I think what was the question?
It was, how do we ask for consent without making it awkward? And I guess whoever wants to jump into from the Zoom land can as well.
So again, I would say that's also on the, like, I think a lot of that should fall on who is producing the content. That it might be challenging for the performers to have that conversation, so it's important to start it professionally with someone who works for the company, going over those things ahead of time.
Anyone on Zoom?
I could jump in if I may. I think it's also like one of those things around like shame and stigma. It feels like if the less you talk about it, then the more uncomfortable it is. But the more you do bring it up, the more that comfort can be built. And then I think that also you can always reframe consent conversations as going back to those feelings that we've kind of brought up a few times, is that it's usually to find out what feels good, right? And usually to find out what feels good, like emotionally, physically, etc. So I think sometimes it can be like, hey, this is kind of awkward, but like, I really just want to make sure that we're all feeling really good, like in multiple ways. So addressing that, maybe that awkwardness. And then, as Mark put it, sometimes it can mean starting the conversation on a text message and then finishing it in person, because now you've already gotten over that hump. I guess no pun intended, but I think it's addressing it, and then making space that where a lot of people are having sex for pleasure. And if you're talking about how to kind of maximize that or find out what feels good for people, then I think that removes some of the awkwardness.
And like, I think talking about that does lead to healthy intimacy with people, right? To be like, this is what's happening and it's going to happen in the bedroom, and that's why it's not a shock or anything, just so you know. So for Emily, what does healthy intimacy look like?
I think healthy intimacy is something that's going to look different depending on every single individual. And it's something that we're each going to figure out as we grow and as we participate in different relationships, and we get to see what we like. And I think acknowledging that healthy intimacy exists on a spectrum is really important. And that for some folks, it might look like a romantic and sexual relationship, and it's this fulfilling piece of all of that. And for someone else, intimacy might look like something really different, that what they want out of an intimate partner might just be sex, or it might just be emotional support. And so I think seeing this spectrum of intimacy and acknowledging that healthy intimacy exists on a spectrum is really helpful, because it also lets us know that our version of intimacy and healthy intimacy can change over time, and that we're allowed to let it change over time. We just need to figure out how we express that desire for change too.
And Topeza, what are some examples of intimacy, sexual and non-sexual?
I love this question. And for someone who's training to be a counseling psychologist, I'm going to say it really depends, and which is something psychology students hate, because humans are very complex and we're not black and white. It's more important that you reflect on what intimacy looks like for you, and how are you going to communicate that to the person or the persons who you will be sharing intimacy with. And I think it's more important to have those open and transparent conversations about not only consent, but also boundaries and expectation management before engaging in any type of intimacy. So everyone is on the same page, and really creating a collaborative space for that, where partners are feeling safe to talk about their wants and needs. And I think sexual intimacy can look like a lot of different ways, like I mentioned, but an example could be penetrative sex with a casual partner, or you were doing a threesome with multiple partners. And I think for non-sexual intimacy could look like engaging with someone emotionally and intellectually in a vulnerable way, and noting that vulnerability looks very different for everyone. So respecting what folks are looking for and what folks are sharing with you is really, really critical here.
Yeah, 100%. I guess a trigger warning for this question. So, according to the BWSS, a woman in Canada is killed by her intimate partner every 48 hours. And truthfully, like as a woman, Indigenous woman, I don't know any woman that hasn't been, you know, like hurt by an intimate partner, not necessarily their intimate partner that they're with right now, but just in general. And it's pretty crazy, and it's like really hard to talk about. So if anyone has like, not feeling comfortable, please go and have a coffee. So do we think that this violence towards women from their intimate partners is a problem due to lack of knowledge lack of knowledge of consent, or is there a bigger problem at hand? This is for Topeza and Emily.
We had a pre-conversation a little bit, and Topeza answered this like really beautifully. So I would love to pass it off to her to take this question to start.
I'm flattered. Thank you, Emily. And I really believe in the idea that the personal is too political, and that this is really a multi-layered problem. There's multiple layers. It's complex. It's messy, like humans are. That has different levels and factors that influences it. So where there's often like intersections and like interactions with us as individuals with the current like societal and political landscape, as we all know. So I think about how my rights as a queer, disabled woman of color and how I access certain healthcare services, such as like abortion, is very much directly related to what the current politics and the laws are in place. So in terms of such a loaded question, I think that is what I'm going to say in terms of like the personal is very much political, and how we navigate the political landscape is also influenced by the different social deterrents of health that are in place.
And I think maybe just to add kind of like a little bit building off what Topeza was saying, that when we're thinking about how the political and the personal mesh together in these really messy ways, and how sometimes it's hard to articulate their connection, when we're talking about women who are losing their life at the hands of their partners, it's, for me at first, it was really tricky to make that link back to consent. But then I started thinking about that if somebody isn't going to respect the consent or boundaries of their female partners, that it is like an escalation to a point where it is potentially not respecting an individual's personhood and their ability to exist in the world. And it's these major extremes, but when you get into it, we're able to find these little common threads throughout it. And I think there's this big piece on like who we value and whether or not the people we value get to stay in society. And so it's not just like if an individual doesn't value their female partner, but it's like, does society value those individuals as well? Because if we did, I think the statistic would look very different.
So how do we practice good consent in and out of the bedroom? I guess this could be for everybody if they want to chime in.
So I have a little jumble of thoughts kind of based on some of the amazing things I've heard. I guess I kind of just wanted to take kind of consent and jump off into, I was kind of thinking about these things, and I think with the impact that kind of porn can have on what people's expectations are from sex, what sex looks like, what sex, how willing partners are. So I would say kind of like a general disclaimer that looking at consent and conversations that happen between two partners and what people are interested in, acknowledging that porn is not, at least for me, a representation of authentic, sexual interaction. Those conversations about consent are not in the final cut. So, it's like, spoiler alert, like, porn's not real. Like, people have mentioned great things here about, speaking up if something doesn't feel good. I would say a lot of porn doesn't feel good. It's important to know when it feels bad. But that's because it's work. A lot of work doesn't always feel good, and kind of finding that, there's that little gray area of like, it is not, for me, if I'm having sex with someone and it's not being filmed, I'm not thinking about my angles. I don't have someone saying, move your leg. The positions that you're finding yourself in are not necessarily comfortable because you're portraying something. Porn to me it's fantasy, it's entertainment, but I think what's tricky is when you have a lot of porn, and this isn't about kink shaming here, but the visual can seem borderline violent. It can seem aggressive, and I think the important thing for kind of taking that outside into relationships is, again, that the conversations that were had ahead of time weren't there on film. So it might look like a scene where someone comes in, finds someone immediately. It's, like I'm being impaled by some giant dick, but like, but you, which you can find. No, I'm kidding. But the viewer might not know what, like, it's like, God, like the first thrusts that are like allowing you to relax aren't there. Like you don't see the version where I'm like, okay, slower. You just see this kind of wham bam. So I think ideally a lot of consent in porn is happening, unfortunately, like not for the viewer to see. Again, it's not like, I can understand if someone's like, I don't want to see that because this is entertainment, this is fantasy. But I think making sure to not use expectations that might be there from porn into a personal relationship, which I feel like I have to do. Like the number of guys who think they can just shove it right in. And I'm like, I need a breath. I need so much lube. And I know that about me, and I will freely communicate that. So kind of advocating for myself has been really important. And yeah, that's kind of what I would say.
And Darren? I guess, sorry, I'll repeat the question. How do we practice good consent in and out of the bedroom?
I think, in like speaking to out of the bedroom, really normalizing conversations around consent is huge, right? A lot of these things feel awkward or they feel like weird because we don't talk about them often. But I've heard this even go so far as now people check in like, hey, are you good with hugs right now? Like, I know you, maybe I just met you, but you kind of, I've seen maybe how you interact with others. So just that constant check-in with like not necessarily sexual interactions as well. And then I really like what was said earlier. I forget who said it, about things existing on a spectrum. I think sometimes we try and hold people to like, well, I heard they did this. They set this boundary once, so that must be their boundary all the time. But then allowing space for that check-in on that spectrum to maybe how that person is feeling right now with this particular relationship, right? Maybe that person likes having sex this way with one person, but likes having it this way with another person. And those boundaries are dynamic and they change because, as was mentioned, people are not black and white and they don't exist in this binary world. They exist across spectrums, right? So I think creating space for check-ins, creating space for normalizing the conversation around consent outside the bedroom, and that can then carry inside the bedroom, and then acknowledging humans as people who exist across spectrums with varying degrees of boundary changes, varying degrees of what feels good, what doesn't. Additionally, I think just in this, speaking from a perspective, this kind of a separate thought around, I know we were talking about maybe sexual violence and such. I think it's important to really begin to reframe like what that rejection looks like. I think a lot of times that rejection of maybe hearing someone say no prompts like feelings of being upset, feelings of being like hurt, or that you're a failure. And then specifically from a masculinity's perspective, prompts people to try again, or that means I have to do better, or that means I have to do this other way, and that will feel good. I saw it this way, maybe in porn, right? So then it kind of, to reframe that rejection, that if someone is saying no to us or sharing boundaries, it's not really about us. It's them feeling good enough to express and set those boundaries because they feel that this could be a safe, trusting space, right? So once you maybe, and you can definitely acknowledge maybe it doesn't feel good to hear that no, and that's okay, validate those feelings, but then move to that space of, okay, well now there's a whole other person here who's also experiencing feelings, thoughts, and emotions with emotions, feelings, and thoughts through their whole body, right? So I think it's important that we start to reframe these interactions as not necessarily be one of failure, but one of growing and moving beyond for like healthy, trusting, and safe relationships in and out of sexual contexts.
Do Emily or Topaz have anything to add?
I think I would just add is practice consent as much as you can. That like you can do it all the time. For one of my friends who I've been good friends with for probably like close to 6 or 7 years, we were having a conversation the other day and she stopped and said, "Oh, I'm about to talk about weight. Is that okay for me to have a conversation with you about weight right now?" And it was a check-in that caught me off guard because I was like, "Oh, we're such good friends, of course." But then I was like, "Oh, this is so nice." Because it was an opportunity for me to say no. And that actually, even though we're such good friends, she didn't make the assumption that it would be fine, even though we've talked about it in the past. And so for me, it was just a really nice reminder that like we can be practicing consent all the time. We can be practicing it with our friends, and that way we just get comfortable. We get comfortable asking. And to Darren's point, ideally, we get comfortable hearing no too. We get comfortable being told no and not taking it too personally.
Yeah, I would say just don't make assumptions ever. No one has a crystal ball that can predict what the folks that they're involved with is thinking about or what their thought process is. And like an intimacy example in regards to like sexual intimacy is I won't know if you like your hair being pulled without asking like, "Hey, do you like your hair being pulled?" And I think a example in terms of like emotional intimacy is like, I won't know if you want me to share about my childhood traumas without asking, "Hey, is it okay if I share a bit about my childhood and the traumas associated with it?" So I think oftentimes it's better to ask and find out what is the containment and the boundaries you're working with that you and the folks that you're involved with has agreed upon before making any assumptions.
Awesome. Okay, so I want to thank all the panelists today for coming. I'll give everyone a round of applause. And again, this is such an important discussion. I'm really happy to be a part of this and meeting everybody. And I want to thank you all. Thank you.